Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Science, Facts, and Fallacies podcast, episode 291.
Wow.
Clipping along here, Liza. It's been almost 2 years, is that right, of you doing this show?
I can't believe it. I don't know where the time has gone. It seems like
Yeah.
yesterday.
Yeah. I have such a good time doing these, as I did with Kevin before, but I just enjoy talking about all of these things that I sometimes lose count, and then I go look it up. I'm like, oh, wow, almost
Yeah.
300. That's awesome.
We have a lot to say.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, if you're new to the show, my name's Cameron English. That's Dr. Liza Dunn. We pull three stories from the headlines on geneticaliteracyproject.org, and we talk about them and try to explicate, to use a big sexy word, some of the details, and hopefully people walk away with a better understanding of the science and sometimes the policy issues that we talk about. So with that, let's jump into these stories. I will say we're coming out of Halloween, Liza, and we're going to talk about seed oils and nutrition a little bit. And I want all of the health gurus out there, all the nutrition wellness influencers. I committed a lot of dietary sins this last week. It's sometimes known as the daddy tax or the mommy tax. You take your kids trick-or-treating and then you pilfer like the IRS. You pilfered the candy bag. You take out all the peanut butter cups. So I had a lot of seed oils this week is what I'm saying for all of you.
I love seed oils.
All you alt health folks out there. So I'm terribly sorry about that. Not really. Okay. Three stories as always. And our first story has to do with that, which is why I tell that fun little anecdote about peanut butter cups. First step here, vegetable oils are often maligned as industrial seed oils that cause inflammation. What does the science say? Next up, loneliness epidemic. As we become more and more isolated, tech companies search for solutions. And finally, following new Idaho law, doctors delayed the pelvic exam of a pregnant 13-year-old girl because they couldn't locate her homeless mother. Wow. What a story. What a story we have there. Okay. Let's jump into these. This first one, Liza, excuse me, I think is a brilliant backgrounder. This is by Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and it's a website called nutrivore.com. And this is great. As I look at this, she just goes through different topics, different myths about nutrition, and just blows them to smithereens. And this is one of the most popular ones these days about vegetable oils or seed oils or industrial oils or whatever pejorative you want to use. But it's just called myth. Vegetable oils are bad for you. And this is, I want to say this is almost a booklet. Like this is quite long. But the science in here is really, really helpful. And Liza, I'll let you explain some of the chemistry involved, some of the details involved. But in essence, if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll see a lot of folks talking about processed foods, ultra-processed foods. Sometimes they talk about sugar. That seems to have fallen out of favor a little bit. You don't hear as much about the evils of sugar. But you hear a lot about seed oils. Like corn oil, cotton oil, soybean oil, these kinds of oils. And the complaint about them is usually that they have to be processed on an industrial scale. You can't just take a soybean and crack it open and get some oil out of it. And then there's these, they call them solvents, but there's these additives you have to use during the processing. And so the concern with these is that those kind of additives can be harmful, but more directly, they're primarily omega-6 fats. And so the more of those you have, the less or out of balance your omega-6 to omega-3s get. And this can have all sorts of, and this part is true as far as I understand. This can have some health effects. Primarily it has to do with inflammation. And like I said, you can explain it. But
Theoretically.
Right. And that's a good point that we'll get into in a second. What I think is fascinating about this is like so many of these topics, whether it's pesticides or crop biotechnology or sugar, like I mentioned a minute ago, it's always something made by a big company, right? That's the unifying theme of all of these, right? It's fast food is bad, soda is bad, frozen food is bad, processed food is bad, seed oils are bad. And of course, what all of these have in common is they're part of a giant food supply chain. And so, if I can speculate a little bit, I think that's really what people are irritated with. So
Yeah, I think so.
they
I think people
yeah.
get this notion, oh, there's corporate control of the food supply. And so we've got to distance ourselves from that, which is not necessarily what's actually happening.
Right. The thing that stuck out to me in this article the most is that the science here, it's not very good. Like
Mm-mm.
a lot of nutrition topics, you have some epidemiology, and there is some clinical research, but there isn't a ton of it. Most of the studies that are cited in support of the idea that omega-6 fats are harmful or seed oils are harmful, um, it's done on lab rats or it's done on
Mm-hmm.
cell culture.
Or, yes, that's exactly in vitro or
Yeah.
animal studies.
So for all the reasons we've explained previously, these studies often don't translate into human health very well because you don't live in a petri dish, you're not a rodent. Um, and oftentimes, the designs of these studies, aside from the fact that it's animals involved, they're just like they're consuming a ton of the stuff, right? Like nobody,
Mm-hmm.
well, I take that back. There's probably some strange person somewhere in the world that loves to eat corn oil, that just likes to open it, drink it by the bottle, right?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, most people don't do that. Most people eat prepared foods that are made with some sort of vegetable oil.
Mm-hmm.
And what she points out in this article is that when you look at actual consumption patterns and you look at studies of people that are actually like given this in a clinical setting, you don't find these negative health effects
Nope.
that are related to heart disease and inflammation and all of these things. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so when you can look at things in vitro, you can look at things in animals, and you are not a cell in a dish. You have a whole complex way of metabolizing things. Fatty acids are really important for cell membrane fluidity, for making hormones, for differing your cholesterol levels, and things like that. And there are some concerns that polyunsaturated fatty acids in the forms of seed oils are able to compete for an enzyme that the omega-6 ones can compete for an enzyme that reduces the effects of the omega-3 fatty acids. And so what the concern is that the omega-3 fatty acids are precursors for chemicals in your body that decrease inflammation, oxidation, and a whole variety of things. So while theoretically that is true, when you look at actually the studies of people who ingest largely they're not drinking corn oil or whatever, but they're ingesting more seed oils versus animal fats as precursors for building up your cell membranes and things like that. They wind up having actually a healthier diet and a better cardiovascular outcome than you do if you're eating, just a diet rich in animal fats. And this has been shown in study after study after study. I'm not saying that a diet rich in animal fats is terrible either. You just need to have, a balance, right? And so you have essential fatty acids in your diet for making very critical components of your cell membranes and your hormones and your anti-inflammatory chemicals, and so it's important to have them as a source of your diet. But it's not the vegetable oils that are high in linoleic acid are not going to clinically be detrimental. There's some claim that it causes oxidation. And oxidation means that you can wind up having, more inflammation around the cell membranes. What oxidation actually is that since these chemicals have double bonds, a lot of double bonds in them, those bonds are easier to break. And because those bonds are easier to break, that might actually, the theory is that will cause an inflammatory cascade. And if you have an oxidizing agent in your body, that what it's looking for is an electron, and an electron is a negatively charged part of an atom, right? And so if you've got a single electron, it's looking for a pair. And another one, so it will pull an electron off of a cell membrane, which is rich in electrons. Cell membranes tend to be negatively charged, and so which is rich in electrons. So it'll pull a cell membrane or pull an electron off a cell membrane, and that part of the cell membrane will go, oh, wait, I'm missing an electron. I need another one. And so you get a chain reaction where there's pulling up of electrons, and the cell membrane falls apart and causes an inflammatory cascade that way. And so most people don't know that that's what oxidation actually is. And so they get very concerned and they bandy that term around all the time. But your body has ways of managing oxidation, and it also uses a lot of what we call redox reactions to manage different chemicals in your blood, different chemicals that come from your diet into your liver, and things like that. Oxidation is a normal. It's a normal part of your body's metabolism. And excess oxidation obviously can cause inflammation, but your body has ways of managing it. And so I think that there's a lot of fear mongering around that term. And so when you actually look at the outcomes of people who are on these diets in very, very large studies, hundreds of thousands of people, you're not finding the kinds of diseases in this group of people that are being alleged by this theoretical mechanism. That was kind of very technical. So
That's okay. That's what people need to hear, though, is what's like actually going on at the metabolic level. A couple of things. So she cites there. I'm actually surprised there's this much research because I had no idea. But she cites a 2011 systematic review of clinical trials found no impact of linoleic acid intake on any of these outcomes that we're typically told this is a serious risk. There was a randomized controlled trial in 2023. An overweight and obese woman found the same thing. There was one study, this was interesting, where they decreased the intake of linoleic acid in the participants by 90%, and then they increased it by as much as 600%. No impact one way, no impact one way or the other. So this isn't to say everyone should eat a diet consisting of Twinkies and Coca-Cola. That's not good for you. But nevertheless, I think people are told wrongly that there are specific food ingredients that are just bad for you. And again, it goes back to that point I made earlier, right? That like big companies make these naughty ingredients that are bad for you, and this is why everyone's health is going to hell in a handbasket, which isn't true. I mean, we do have an obesity problem. Mm-hmm. And a problem more generally with non-communicable disease. Mm-hmm. But it's not easy to pin it on a single nutrient. I think that's, and it's a classic point. That's not my original
It is, and I will contend that it has to do with overconsumption and a sedentary lifestyle. And there are all sorts of ways you can talk about controlling this, but you get a benefit out of walking around the block and not eating too much Halloween candy.
But I want to blame somebody for why I had a stomach ache after I ate all those peanut butter cups. You know, if I can blame Reese's, then I don't have to be accountable for my actions, and I like that way. Anyways, there's a whole bunch more to say. We're not going to say it because we don't want to bore everyone to death, because there's a lot of really detailed science in here. But I would recommend read this slowly, then go back and read it again. And then read it one more time. It's really
interesting.
Yeah. This is the kind of content that's really helpful, but it's not a romance novel. And so it's not appealing to read. But if you read this and take the time to understand it, the next time you hear, I don't know, Andrew Huberman or like whoever the influencer is, you'll go, oh yeah, I know that's not true because I looked at all this research.
That's right.
So yeah, a little bit of balance. Just read Aristotle, okay? Stop. You don't even have to read nutritional epidemiology. Just go read Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. It's just balance, right? It's just there's a golden mean, not too much, not too little. It's the best way to live your life, everyone. There you go. Okay, let's move on here. This is a story about loneliness. This is originally from the BBC's Science Focus. This is by Alex Hughes from early October. They're talking here about the what's often referred to as the loneliness epidemic. You have a lot of people who are going through their lives. They work, and then they go home, and they withdraw from society. You know, they start to isolate from their family or their friends or whatever social context they have, and it's because they're lonely. It's this kind of paradoxical response.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm no psychiatrist, so I can't really explain why that happens. But from this article, what they say is people don't want to burden others, right? They feel
Mm-hmm.
bad about feeling lonely. And so that's perceived as them cutting themselves off, but what's really happening is they're lonely and they don't know how to process it or deal with it. Um, and so what they're talking about in this story is the implementation of artificial intelligence to help, I guess, mitigate the symptoms of loneliness that people are experiencing. And they talk about some of these chatbot programs that are being used for this purpose. Um, as I've said on a lot of these kind of stories, I'm just inherently uncomfortable with these kind of solutions
Mm-hmm.
because the whole problem is, right, people are isolated. They need a sense of community. They're struggling with, um, and they break it into three different categories. People, they're struggling with communicating their concerns and their feelings to
Mm-hmm.
other people, or they feel sort of systemically isolated, like they feel like they're an outcast from the group for one reason or another, or there's a sort of existential loneliness where people they end up somewhere and they go, I don't understand the purpose of my life and I don't get why I'm here. This all seems pointless,
Right.
and I'm a nihilist kind of thing.
Right.
Um, and so apparently you can kind of cater these AI programs to deal with whatever kind of loneliness people are experiencing. But basically, it works the same way that something like ChatGPT does, where you just feed a bunch of data into it and then it spits it back out at you. In this case, in the form of like a conversation, like you can train these programs to dialogue with you, and I don't know,
Give you
sort of,
suggestions or make you give you kinds of methods for feeling better, or kind of actually be your friend and give advice or listen to your worries. And yes, and actually I thought that the one that got hacked was kind of funny.
yeah, yeah, of
So
course, because you're dealing with computer programs that are hackable.
that
Um,
are hackable, and
but
it's supposed to be making you feel better, and then instead it started talking about sex.
yeah, that's the other thing, right? Is and I've read another. There was one. I think we talked about it. There was one instance where some program actually, after talking to someone, suggested that he kill himself.
Which is crazy, right?
Yeah, and I now again that's probably an outlier. They're not all going to do that, but
Unless you're in Canada.
oh boy, yeah, go listen to last week's episode if you want to get that joke. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like the simple fix here. This is the thing with articles like this is we're so tech addled and we're so focused on individual solutions for individual people that we don't step back and go, well, you need to re-engage with other people, right? You don't need
Right.
an AI that is so sophisticated that it's almost a person. You need
You need
you
to
prob
talk to real people.
right. You need in many cases you need professional help. You need someone who can help you sort out what's going on up here and develop the skills that will allow you to go out in the world and engage with people and form meaningful relationships. You don't need you don't
Especially if
need
you've been trapped
yeah.
in your house since COVID and now are too afraid to go out. You need to engage with people. We're social
Yeah.
beings. We don't do well in talking to a robot is not the I think ideal way to manage loneliness.
Yeah. And see, the thing that's so odd is that that doesn't even come up in the story. It's just sort of, and again, it's a short article. It's not like a treatise on how to live your life, but the, not even a mention of, well, maybe you don't need a sophisticated computer program. Maybe you need community.
That's right. That's right. And it's funny if you get involved with community and you do it in a way that is not sort of feeling very focused on yourself. I feel like one of the things that probably contributes to loneliness the most is all of these self-help books and self-help this and self-help that. It's all about focused on how you can make yourself be better. And you see these, beautiful people doing wonderful things, and it seems so. And how come I can't have that? Well, one of the ways that I think is probably the most self helpful is to get out and go do something for somebody else. And when you start doing something for somebody else and remove your self doubt and things like that, it is actually much more fulfilling. And I think that we've lost sight of that. It's all about me, and navel gazing. And I don't want to have people who are depressed or lonely feel like I'm belittling their case, because I do think that they are depressed. I do think that they are lonely, and I think that there is an epidemic of it, especially since COVID. But getting one of the ways to really lift yourself out of that is to engage with people, and maybe stop feeling like, or just thinking that you have to do something more like internally facing to feel better. You feel better when you go do stuff with people, and also when you do stuff for people.
There's a great book I read many years ago. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's written by a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl.
Mm-hmm.
And he's sort of like the head of a whole school of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a great book because he's a Holocaust survivor, and he talks about the mental state that he cultivated to survive Auschwitz. I think it's the camp he was in.
Mm-hmm.
But he survived, and he talks about that. But then in the second half of the book, he talks about how some of the things that he learned through that he took back into his practice with his patients. And he tells the story of this one gentleman whose wife died, and the guy's despondent and he's lonely, and he's just, it's like, he's like, I don't understand why I'm here. Without my wife, I'm just useless. And his first question to this guy, Viktor Frankl, he says, what would have happened if you died and your wife survived? What would she be like? He said, well, she'd be a mess. She'd be worse than I am. She wouldn't be able to handle it. And so Viktor Frankl, if I remember the passage right, he says, well, maybe this is your purpose, right? Like, your purpose was to live through this because she wouldn't have been able to. And the guy, like, a light bulb went on in that minute. And the guy goes, thanks, doctor. Walked out of the office, right? So, like, all it took, and again, I'm not saying that this is like a judo chop that's going to solve everyone's problems, but all it took was that guy realizing that, oh, there's the purpose in my suffering. There's why I'm here. And he was able to go out and function. So there's lots of stories like that, but it's really interesting. Like, it all comes down to sort of focusing outward, right? Stop, as you said, navel gazing, but focus on the reasons you're here and what you can do with the time you have and the resources you have. And that seems to be what helps people in these kind of situations.
I really think so. And I think that that's one of the kind of negative things of social media. It's like, look how much fun I'm having. You can do this too if you do this, that, and the other. Buy my product, whatever. And so people spend a lot of time trying to, why am I not like this person? Once you start thinking outside of yourself, it's really amazing what kind of transformation can happen. It's hard to do. I'm not belittling it, but it's amazing.
Yeah, most things worth doing are, I mean, to use a cliche, right? It's most things, they're not hard to understand how to do them, but they take effort, and it's uncomfortable to change yourself.
Yeah.
But it's possible. I mean, like, I've talked about Mark Lewis's work. He's a neuroscientist who works with addicts. And that's one of the things he says is, like, people who beat their addictions, they literally have to rewire their brains.
Yep.
By refocusing how they think. But it's hard, and it takes time, but it's doable. The other final thing that I'll mention is that, and I said the same thing last week when we were talking about assisted suicide, and how people just reach a state where they don't want to live, and so the government is increasingly in different countries saying, okay, well, we'll give you some drugs to, sedate you and then kill you because your life is meaningless. It's such a difficult thing to talk about. I'm sorry. But what I said last week is that the things that give life meaning, and this is just, you can understand this from an evolutionary perspective, like family, right? We evolved in these small bands of hunter-gatherers, right? These little tribes of people. and family is a fundamental component of that. But
Yep.
like you said, like with the whole climate change thing, you have people writing articles saying, I regret having children. I wonder how their children feel about those stories, right? But they
I
say,
know, right?
I regret having children because they are impacting the climate. You shouldn't have children, for the sake of preserving the climate. Again, why we need to protect the climate if there's not going to be additional generations of people.
Exactly.
I don't know. It doesn't make sense. But we've increasingly turned into a world where all that matters is your individual autonomy and how you feel in the moment and whether you're having fun. And those sort of relationships are frowned upon for various reasons, or they're seen as optional, right? Like you don't really need to get married and have kids. That's just like you do you.
That's an old-fashioned notion.
Right. Same
Yeah.
thing with like, the kind of cultural institutions. And there's been a lot of interesting research on this over the decades. People find their identity in their local church or their local PTA or their local sports league. Like all of these things that they seem superficially trivial to a certain extent, but they create these bonds that keep people grounded.
They do.
Yes. Like the book I'm thinking of, it's called The Quest for Community. It was written years ago by a sociologist named Robert Nisbet. And it's so fascinating. I think he wrote it in the 50s or the 60s, but he's talking about how even then you were starting to see this groundswell of self-help. And he doesn't call it self-help, but there's this whole sort of movement to help people grapple with this new world that they're living in, where you're starting to see, here's how you live on your own in this new kind of society we're arranging, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because that was what, 60 years ago that he's talking about this
Isn't it
stuff.
unbelievable? Yeah.
Right. This is before
Yeah.
social media. This is before all of the things that we're talking about now. So it was really prescient. But that's sort of the work that I'm talking about. It's like all of these communities, they've been dissolved. People move around with globalization or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then, wow, everyone's lonely. Well, maybe we can create a computer program that'll fix it. Anyways, go check out that article. It's really short. Go read Quest for Community. Great book.
Yeah,
It's
we'll
really
look it
long.
up.
It's really long. Just FYI.
That's okay.
Anyways, but it's good. Okay, let's move on to our final story here, Liza. This one, I don't know what to say about this. So this is originally from the Washington Post. It's by Karen Brouillard. It's called "A Young Teen Gives Birth. Idaho's Parental Consent Law Snags Her Care." Yeah, this is one of those articles that you read and you kind of wonder if it's real. Like
Yeah.
I had to go back and go, wow, this is like a real story in a real newspaper.
Yep.
But in essence, it follows this 13-year-old girl who got pregnant. The father is
13.
no longer in the picture because he's also very young, and so he's not going to stay around to be a dad because he's 13. The girl's mother is homeless. She lives in a car somewhere. Her grandmother is her guardian, but she's in a state prison on drug charges.
Mm-hmm.
So this
And-
girl is staying with her great aunt, I think.
Well, she bounced around from foster home to foster home and is eventually at her great aunt's. So she's had a very complicated life.
Yes, let's put it that way. But the focus of the story, after kind of setting up this anecdote, is that Idaho recently passed a parental consent law that says that healthcare providers and school administrators and any kind of official who's in charge of your child's health in some capacity has to share information with the parents. They can't exclude the parents from the decision-making process in most cases, and they have to provide whatever information about whatever treatment they're considering giving. We'll get into why that is in a second. But the Post is sort of setting this up as a bad thing, that basically what happened in this case is this girl went into labor. She went to the ER because she doesn't have health insurance. And the doctor...
She was accompanied by an adult.
She was accompanied by, I think it was her aunt.
Yep.
And the ER doctors were afraid to do a pelvic exam to see if she was actually in labor because this law had just taken effect. And so they called the hospital's lawyers to see what they were allowed to do. And so as the story unfolds, you hear from, they call them teen advocates and sociologists and, like the consensus of big brains who say this law was a very bad idea because presumably this girl's health is at risk. Um, and I'm not sure what like how to phrase what I'm what I'm thinking about this story, Liza. So maybe you can jump in because you are both a parent and a doctor. So I'm very
I'm a
curious.
parent and a doctor. I have been, and I've taken care of kids. I've taken care of grown-ups. I've delivered lots of babies, and I've I've been involved with DNCs in the emergency department because of miscarriages. I've been involved with taking care of women with ectopic pregnancies. So this is something that I'm very intimately familiar with. And uh, this young lady was 36 weeks pregnant and she was having bleeding. That is either imminent delivery or a pregnancy complication. That automatically is an emergency. And this law says that you do not have to get parental consent if it is an emergency, specifically in the law, is what it states. And so, what I feel, and I'll actually read the text of the law if that's not too boring. I got to pull it up really quick. Um, Subsection 3 of this section shall not apply, and a healthcare provider may authorize or furnish a healthcare service without obtaining the informed consent of the minor child's parent if A, the parent of the minor child has given blanket consent authorizing the healthcare provider can do it, and B, the healthcare provider reasonably determines that a medical emergency exists and that if that medical emergency is not addressed, that harm will come to that child. So it's very clearly stated in this provision that they could take care of this child. And at 36 weeks, if you are going to have that baby's going to come, regardless or not, regardless if you want to provide help delivering that baby or not, that baby's going to make its arrival on the scene. So my contention is that physicians who either purposely are not treating sick patients or are actually incompetent enough to let people die should be held accountable. I think that this article is terribly misleading in the discussion that they've had. They even said later on in the article that that these children might be at risk of having, if for example, if there had been an abuser in the picture, and that the abuser would have access to her medical records, and that's that. They made this claim that is specifically also called out in the language of this legislative piece. The abuser will not get access to the medical records. So while I understand that the whole sort of abortion debate is nuanced, and I feel very sorry for the women who are involved in this, do not lie. Do not lie in your claims about what's happening. And I'm finding that a lot of these discussions around these topics are becoming wildly exaggerated. Women not being able to get care for ectopic pregnancies. Well, that is not true. And any doctor who does not treat an ectopic pregnancy, it should be held accountable for that because they know that this is life-threatening for the woman. So I just think it's frustrating having to listen to these extreme cases be touted as fact.
Yeah, you just cannot trust the press, really on any topic, frankly. But on these kind of issues that have to do with parental consent and children's health, and these really inflammatory topics like abortion and transgender affirming care for trans youth, like all, you just can't trust them because they're often very dishonest. So like
Yeah.
in this article, they don't link to the law, they don't quote the law, they don't tell you about the caveats that Liza just read. So when I tracked down the bill, when we both tracked down the bill and read it, both of the concerns that are the thrust of this Washington Post piece are addressed. Namely, that as the physician can say, this is an emergency situation. I need to take care of this patient, or they're gonna be permanently injured, or they're gonna die.
Yeah.
Right? And it's up to their medical judgment to determine. It specifically says that in the law. And then on the issue of abuse, it says that law enforcement can intervene if there is reasonable suspicion that this kind of a situation is going on, like the abuser is trying to get access to the medical records, or there's something untoward going on, and the state does need to intervene to protect the child. And that is not explained, right? So now maybe you could go and make an argument. You can say, and I'm not a lawyer, but you could, some legal expert could say, well, I'm a lawyer, and this is the sort of language you use when you're trying to, get around a technicality or something, right? So maybe there's an argument to be had that the language of the law is insufficient, but the Post doesn't even attempt that explanation.
Nope.
And that's what bugs me, is that they take what is,
A
teen
horrific
pregnancies,
situation. A
right?
13-year-old girl who is pregnant, who's has chosen to keep the baby, right? And they've framed it in a way that is like, this is so evil. What's happened to her? Well, she's free to make her choice to keep that baby if she wants to. One, right? I don't necessarily think that that she's got the wherewithal to be a mother. But I think that, the claims that are made in this article are really, really egregious.
Yeah, and there's a, for as passionate as the press is about these kind of topics, there's a lack of curiosity. Like, why is this 13-year-old pregnant? Like, what sorts of influences in her life led her to make that decision?
Exactly.
And I mean, and like 13 is really young to be sexually active. I think
Yes.
like most teenagers, it's at least a little bit later.
Yes.
So there's no discussion about that. There's no discussion of, why is the grandmother, who is the legal guardian, in prison on drug charges? Like, how did that happen, right? Like, what decisions did she make? Why is the mother homeless? Why is she not in the picture? Where's her father at? Like, there's no, like, it's just sort of taken, like, this is the state of nature, that you have this broken, fractured family and this girl left on her own, more or less, unless some other person in the family gets involved. There's no discussion about that. And it really bothers me, because it's such a drastic case. And the other thing that's like truly bizarre is it frames parents being involved in their children's medical decisions as scandalous.
Being a bad thing.
Right. Like there are truly edge cases where you have parents that abuse their children. No doubt that goes on. But you don't write a law assuming that's
that
the
all
baseline.
Parents, that's
right.
the baseline. That parents don't have the best interest of their children at heart. I mean, most parents don't abuse their children, right? In fact, you get a lot of strangers who do abuse children. And you're talking about the people who have the most interest naturally in their children handing off their rights to a state entity. I'm sorry. I just don't think that. I don't think that's the case. And that's a very dim view of parenthood. Very dim view of parenthood. And as a parent, I actually resent that. I want the best for my kids.
Yeah. It's bizarre, like I said. Like, you can trust a school counselor, you can trust a medical doctor who may or may not have an ongoing relationship with your child, but you probably can't trust the parent that brought the person into
the hospital in the first place,
or into the world to go.
Yes. Yes.
And I find that weird. Like, it's just an assumption, because if you were to look at any data, in most cases, most parents don't abuse their children. And there's legal protections in place. Like, when you go to get health care now, and it's even funny, like, they do it to me. Like, I'm a 36-year-old grown man, and I have to answer this survey about whether my wife beats me or not.
I mean,
right.
It's insane.
But just to illustrate, our healthcare system has incredible safeguards in place for identifying cases where there's abuse or neglect or whatever. So it's just so strange to me. But then the other thing that there's no curiosity about in this story is, why would Idaho, or any state for that matter, because several states have passed laws like these, Why would the state feel it is necessary to enshrine in law that parents are allowed to have access to their children's medical records?
I wonder.
What going on in our culture right now would alarm normal parents about
Hmm.
what's happening in the schools or what's happening in a healthcare setting? I can't really think of anything. Is there like,
Right. Are
you
there
know,
maybe some trends that are happening in our
right,
popular culture that make parents very, very anxious about the futures of their children?
right. And of course we're talking about the trans healthcare thing for kids, which is just so absolutely wildly insane to me that this is
That
even
we're
being
even having the
discussed.
discussion.
Yeah, it's delusional, and it's you want to talk about being pro science,
Mm.
it's based in a fundamentally flawed ideology. It's insane. But nevertheless, the point I'm making is that, you know, let's look at why Idaho would pass a law like this. And the answer is that a lot of insane things are happening in schools and in healthcare settings.
Hmm.
And the reason you are not you, but the reason there is an effort to exclude parents from these decisions is because the parents caring about their children are going to go, not so fast, Skippy.
Hold
Why
up.
not? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I don't know. It's just a wild story. There's so many obvious flaws here that are just totally ignored.
Yep. And I unfortunately think that there are a lot of stories out there like that where, and it gets ordinary people very scared. Oh, I'm not going to be able to get health care if I have a miscarriage. Oh, I'm not going to be able to get health care if I have an ectopic pregnancy. I'm not going to be able to get health care. That is just not true. And I think that if physicians are actually letting people die, uh, to me, that's just egregious.
I have read not all, but I've read most of those state level laws, those abortion ban laws, because I just get curious. Like I read news articles like this, and I go, I'm going to go read the law, and I'm just going to see. Um, in every one that I've read, the text of the law says um, doctors can and should intervene to save the life of the mother,
Yeah.
or you know what I mean. So there's
Yep.
language in there. So like the fundamental complaint is usually wrong, and I don't know why that is not mentioned. The other thing,
So
and
what's Go ahead.
no, no, please go ahead. That's all right.
So there was a the comment about, yeah, how Christianity was involved in this as well. And what I think is really interesting is when I was in Haiti during the earthquake, or the earthquake relief mission, we had a huge group working in this Boy Scout camp that was acting as a clinic for people, so people with injuries and things like that. But we also got a lot of pregnant women, and we had a woman who had severe preeclampsia, and which is life threatening. And the cure for preeclampsia is delivering the baby. And so I was from, a university. We had people from the military. We had some naturopaths there. We had the Portland Fire Department there. We had a bunch of fundamentalist Christian organizations that were delivering healthcare as well. And so when this woman showed up, we realized she needed to have the baby delivered. And the baby was probably maybe 7 months gestation. Remember, we're operating with very, very little equipment and possibilities, and we're remote. So I wound up driving this woman with one of the firefighters in the middle of the night through roads and crevasses and stuff all the way to Port-au-Prince to be able to try to get her delivered. We stabilized her blood pressure. We gave her some magnesium. We gave her some steroids to help the baby's lungs mature and things like that. But if you don't deliver that baby, both baby and mom will die. If you do deliver that baby might survive, mom will live. And so that's the kind of conundrum that you have, right? And long and short is, when I had that discussion with the fundamentalist Christian medical student and several of the other people that were in that group with him, and they got the Christian doctors backed me up. They realized, okay, And so, and when they understood the pathophysiology of the disease and all of that stuff, they were 100% on board. So this is a conversation that you can have with people if you can, if you, and who fundamentally disagree with your point of view on abortion. And I don't know any Christian OBs that would disagree with this perspective. So uh, it is what it is. And fortunately, both baby and mom lived.
One other thing to add, and I think that's a great point that you made. You know, like the way the media reports on this, it's like people exist in this weird vacuum where they're totally consumed by their ideology,
Yeah,
even if they're physicians. You know, like we have to define what every person who identifies in that way, you know, right wing conservative Christian or whatever. Like we have to identify all of them based on what someone said on TikTok. You know,
right.
or like there's back in the day it was Pat Robertson, this like
Yeah.
who is who is a truly goofy character. Don't get me wrong. I actually think he said that the earthquake in Haiti was judgment from God on.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Anyway,
Yeah,
anyways,
there are some wackies out there.
yeah. There's wackies in every camp, no doubt about it. But there's I don't know. There's just this refusal to give the benefit of the doubt or to treat people like they're sensible until they prove otherwise, right? Like,
Right.
and here's another example this is from the Post story. They talk about this legislation. And here's a direct quote. Such legislation is another front in the parental rights movement that has pushed for book bans and school curriculum restrictions. And then the law was supported by the Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is a conservative Christian group that has notched several U.S. Supreme Court victories and points to gender-affirming school counseling as an example of youth health care gone awry. And they are correct about that. Okay?
They are.
Like, that is...
And we will look back at this time period as physicians 100 years from now and say, wait, what? You can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl? That we will look back at, we will. It will come back.
Right. And by the way, this thing on book bans, I don't know, like this is willful ignorance, right? I'm saying this as a parent. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, but I am a dad. And I'm going to tell anyone who's listening or watching this, you are not allowed to show my children pornographic material under the guise of educating them. And
Nope.
that is precisely what these bills regulate, right?
Yep.
There is sexually explicit content in a lot of these books, and parents see that and they go, no thanks, and the school boards get involved and they say this is banned. They're not banning 1984. They're not banning
Nope.
the U.S. Constitution. They're not banning the canon of Western literature.
Nope.
They are pulling this garbage literature out of
Pornography off the shelves.
Yes.
And if grown-ups want to read pornography, then have at it. But not in grade schools.
Yeah. And I went to check. Like I didn't just take the word for it, but I looked up some of these books, and it's just sexually explicit. It's gross.
Yeah.
And kids should not be reading that. And parents are well within their rights to get that out. And the same thing with curriculum. Like.
And you wonder how 13-year-olds get pregnant.
Yeah. But see, that was the point I was making earlier, right? It's like you teach people at increasingly younger ages that sexuality is it's this fun thing and you get to enjoy it and that's all there is to it. Here's a condom. Right? What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Yeah.
Anyway, so it's not it's this kind of thing where they make it this sort of libertarian issue. It's all about freedom. Of course, the same people who demand that your kids have access to these books have no problem with the federal government censoring the internet.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is comical to me, right? Like you as an adult, you can't read a New York Times story about vaccine side effects, rare vaccine side effects, because you're too dumb to understand the information. But if we want to show your kids effectively porn in school, well,
that's a civil right.
Yeah. What are you, against free speech?
Yeah.
Anyways,
It's so crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, let's wrap it up there. But just to suffice it to say, you have to read the law when it comes to an issue like this. And everyone's got an opinion. That's okay. Clearly, we have opinions. But when you're withholding information from people and you're presenting things that are technically wrong, That's not journalism. That's
Don't
just
lie.
this just honest advocacy. Yeah.
Don't lie.
Yeah.
Tell the truth.
Yeah. It's a good policy, especially if you are a reporter.
That's what science is supposed to be about. Tell the truth.
Yeah. Anyways, well, if we lost friends on that one, I'm sorry. We still like you guys.
Me too.
Hopefully you'll
Yeah.
hopefully
If you disagree with us, you can come talk to us about it. Well, listen.
yeah, come to the spaces, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. A lot of people will say you're a bigot and you're trying to shut people out of the conversation. Then you invite them to the space and they go, "Well, why would I talk to bigots?" That's your problem then, dude. Anyways.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to come to our spaces and follow us on Twitter, our handles are at Dr. Liza MD. I'm at CamJ English. We love your comments, your questions, your feedback. We got some feedback, which I forgot to address this time, but we'll address it on the next episode. Get some feedback on the physician-assisted suicide thing that we were talking about.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll come back to that. But come to the spaces. We love interacting. Thank you guys as always for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.